The Maine State Archives holdings comprise collections that are both vast and varied. Here's a brief look at just a few of our many historical records. In the late 19th century, James Finney Baxter was a passionate antiquarian who commissioned copies of important European maps. He donated almost 90 such maps to the archives. This particular copy is of a 1684 map of New France, New England, and the Great Lakes, originally drawn by William Hack for Great Britain. Due primarily to the fact that Maine was a fairly new state when the Civil War began, the Archives' Civil War collection is perhaps one of the most extensive in the country, not necessarily in volume, but certainly in variety. One jewel from our Civil War collection is Joshua Chamberlain's 8-page report from a field near Gettysburg. In this moving correspondence to brigade headquarters, Colonel Chamberlain vibrantly describes the pivotal role played by the 20th Maine Volunteers at Little Round Top. Quote, "In the midst of this struggle, our ammunition utterly failed. As a last desperate resort, I ordered a charge. The word 'fix bayonets' flew from man to man. The click of steel seemed to give new zeal to all. The men dashed forward with a shout." Another facet of our Civil War collection are our extensive carte de visite images. This black and white visiting card atypically shows not only the soldier, Captain William A. Barrows from the 9th Maine Infantry, but also his wife. This same Mrs. Barrows is part of the Archives' Adjutant General's incoming correspondence collection from the same time period. In this 1862 letter, Mrs. Barrows is appealing to Governor Israel Washburn in the hopes of receiving state aid for relief. With 4 children and a lingering sickness causing her to be, quote, "very needy," she includes in her appeal the following: "I wish your excellency to inform me if there is not a law to or for the soldiers' family support," end quote. As a young state, Maine had not yet solidified such a law, but by the end of the war, it certainly had. 2 years later, in October of 1864, Mrs. Barrows writes again. Having heard conflicting reports as to whether or not her husband was still alive, she writes to General Hodgson, quote, "If you will please inform yourself of the truth of his arrival and also inform me, I will pay all expenses, and may God ever bless you for the kind act which you perform," end quote. Since she is willing to, quote, "pay for all expenses," one can only infer that her first letter was met with some form of financial compensation. Here is a wonderful photograph from an 1877 reunion of Civil War soldiers from the 1st Maine Cavalry. Taken at Old Orchard Beach, you can see Frederick Douglass, who happened to be in Maine on a speaking tour, standing in the front row next to the young girl. We turn now from photography to artwork in the form of business trademarks. In its collection from Maine's Bureau of Corporations, Elections, and Commissions, the Archives houses hundreds of registered trademarks from companies either located in Maine or seeking to do business in Maine. These banners highlight just a fraction of the Archives' trademark holdings and were created as part of an exhibit celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Archives in 2015.
Trademarks are not the only images we have. The Archives house a great collection of Maine photos. George French worked for almost 20 years capturing images of Maine that promoted its economic and tourism potential. We selected just a few of these striking black and white images out of our nearly 7,000 images in our own George French collection. Here is a journal gifted to the Maine State Archives by Camp Keys, a military training base in Augusta, with an entry from 1800 mentioning George Washington's death the previous month and recommending that every officer wear a black crape on the left upper arm for 1 month as a memorial gesture. The Maine State Archives has a fair amount of treaties involving native tribes. Shown here is the Passamaquoddy Treaty of Peace, dated the 20th day of February, 1852, concerning the negotiation of rights, including a stipulation to elect their own governor. Court records, including items such as docket books and case files, comprise a significant portion of our holdings. Pictured here is a 1834 death warrant identified by a black ribbon. In this particular case, Joseph Sager of Gardner was charged with murdering his wife. Following his conviction in the Supreme Judicial Court of Kennebec County, he was given a sentence of death per Executive Council. By 1887, the death penalty in Maine was officially abolished. Perhaps one of our longest documents in our holdings is this 1841 slavery petition scroll. An impressive 50 feet in length, it contains over 3,000 signatures, all of Maine women. It wouldn't be until the end of 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was finally ratified, that slavery in the U.S. was formally abolished.
Abraham Lincoln was elected as president in 1860, and in this document we see the Electoral College of Maine's vote for Abraham Lincoln. We have these documents going back to 1820, and they show the views of the Electoral College in Maine and how it operated. The Maine State Archives also holds the acts and resolves of the state dating back to 1820. In this resolve we see the state has issued money to a John Baker. This resolve from 1846 has the state giving money to the heirs of John Baker of Thomaston. But in 1846, all matters of government had to pass before the Executive Council. The Executive Council lasted from 1820 to 1976 and acted as advisors to the governor. What is especially interesting in the Executive Council file for this resolve is the paperwork documenting John Baker. These papers include a document from Biarritz, France, in order to prove that Jean-Baptiste Sarbeyron and John Baker were the same person. It is unclear why this French man moved to Maine and changed his name, and why the state felt the need to provide money for his heirs. Portraits also make up a large portion of our holdings, particularly the officers of the state. The governors, secretaries of state, attorneys general, and treasurers all have portraits at the archives dating back to 1820. These two portraits, in particular, are of Stephen Emery and Hannibal Hamlin, son of the Vice President of the United States from Maine. These two men were attorneys general for the state of Maine, and Hamlin was a grandson of Stephen Emery through his mother. The Revolutionary War also can be researched at the Maine State Archives by using documents such as the land bounty records. These records are made up of a number of different sets, including from a few of the county courts, one set of Massachusetts land grants, and another set of Maine land grants. This particular example is for Abia Hine, the widow of Richard Hine, a sergeant in the Revolutionary War. As a widow, she was eligible to receive a grant, but needed to prove Richard's service in the war. One of the documents used to prove this, shown here, is an affidavit from Richard himself describing his service. Other pieces include testimonies from people who had served with him. Ultimately, Abia was able to prove his service and received a piece of land from the state. Other land records can be found in the Land Office collection. Perhaps the most notable of these records are the plan book maps, of which we have over 1,500. These are a mixture of maps created by early Maine surveyors and copies of maps of land in Maine from Massachusetts. The item shown here is from Plan Book 1 and shows the southern tip of Moosehead Lake in Greenville, surveyed by Alexander Greenwood. Another important document can be found in the early court records of the state. Our court records continue all the way up to the early 2000s, but go back at the county level to the beginnings of the county, and even earlier for some. For example, the York County records go back to 1636, when Maine was actually a royal province. This charter from 1637 is from Charles I, King of England, and gives the province of Maine to Ferdinando Gorges. The charter is multiple pages long and describes the land and the responsibilities of Gorges. And finally, perhaps the most important document in our holdings is the 1819 State Constitution. The Constitution is the fundamental document to the state, and this features signatures of Maine's first governor. In addition to this edition of the Constitution, we also have an 1876 edition and two working copies of the 1819 version in scroll form that shows the edits made by those present at the Constitutional Convention.